Ted Cruz leaned forward just enough for the microphones to catch the edge in his voice, looked directly at Ilhan Omar, and delivered a line so sharp that the hearing room seemed to physically recoil, saying that the greatest irony in modern American politics was not that refugees criticized America, but that some refugees arrived here, climbed every rung of freedom's ladder, and then tried to kick it down behind them. For a brief moment, the room froze, not because of volume or theatrics, but because the accusation cut straight to the unspoken tension beneath the entire hearing. A tension that had followed Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar across cable news panels, social media feuds, and ideological battle lines for years. I remember watching that moment and thinking that this was not simply another partisan exchange engineered for viral clips, but a collision between two worldviews that could not coexist peacefully, each claiming moral authority, each insisting that the other fundamentally misunderstood America itself. From that instant forward, the debate stopped being about policy checklists or talking point skirmishes and became something far more consequential. A referendum on gratitude versus grievance, accountability versus identity, and whether political power exists to serve constituents or to settle ideological scores. Ted Cruz understood this instinctively, and Ilhan Omar sensed it too, even if she would never admit it aloud, because both of them knew the stakes extended far beyond a single committee hearing and into the deeper story Americans tell themselves about who deserves to speak for the nation. The hearing itself had begun in a predictable fashion, with Ilhan Omar opening aggressively, framing the proceedings as a politically motivated attack designed to silence a Muslim woman of color who dared challenge entrenched power, a narrative she had refined over years of public conflict. Her tone was forceful, her language carefully calibrated to signal defiance, and her accusations against Ted Cruz were sweeping, painting him as a symbol of systemic cruelty, hypocrisy, and selective compassion, particularly on immigration and civil liberties. To many observers, this was familiar territory because Ilhan Omar had long relied on a strategy that blended moral absolutism with identity framing, making any challenge to her conduct appear indistinguishable from an attack on her existence. Ted Cruz, by contrast, remained almost unnervingly still, taking notes with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades training for adversarial confrontation, and I could not help but notice how deliberately he refused to respond emotionally. That restraint was not accidental, because Cruz understood something fundamental about modern political combat. Outrage is loud, but evidence is lethal. And once the conversation shifts to facts tied to real people, slogans lose their protective power. When Cruz finally spoke, his voice carried none of the hostility his critics expected, and that contrast alone destabilized the narrative Ilhan Omar had tried to establish, because calm does not look like oppression, and questions do not sound like hatred. Instead of defending himself or his party, Cruz reframed the hearing around a single premise that would define the rest of the exchange, stating that politics mattered less than people, and ideology mattered less than responsibility. At that point, I realized something important as an analyst and as an American who has watched countless hearings dissolve into performative chaos, because this was not a man trying to score points, but one attempting to dismantle a moral shield he believed had been abused. Ted Cruz did not accuse Ilhan Omar of being unpatriotic in the simplistic sense, nor did he question her right to criticize America, because doing so would have handed her exactly the narrative she wanted. Instead, he questioned whether criticism without accountability eventually becomes exploitation, a question that strikes at the heart of modern political activism and makes both supporters and critics deeply uncomfortable. Ilhan Omar, for her part, seemed momentarily unsettled by the shift, because she had prepared for combat, not interrogation, and certainly not for a confrontation grounded in constituent impact rather than ideological theory. This distinction matters more than most viewers initially realize because American politics has increasingly rewarded symbolic defiance while quietly tolerating administrative neglect, and Ted Cruz was challenging that imbalance directly. What followed was not a shouting match or a dramatic interruption, but a methodical unfolding of stories, names, and unanswered questions that forced the audience to confront an uncomfortable possibility: that moral language can be used to obscure moral failure. As someone who studies political incentives closely, I found this approach particularly striking because it inverted the usual power dynamic, placing Ilhan Omar not as the victim of institutional hostility, but as the steward of trust who owed explanations. The underlying conflict between Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar has never truly been about left versus right in the conventional sense, but about fundamentally different interpretations of what America owes its citizens and what its citizens owe America in return. Cruz's worldview, shaped by his family's refugee history, treats American opportunity as something earned through sacrifice and preserved through responsibility, a perspective that prizes gratitude as a civic virtue rather than a rhetorical weakness. Omar's worldview, shaped by her own displacement and activism, treats America as a system perpetually on trial, where moral legitimacy flows from critique rather than contribution, and where personal narrative often substitutes for administrative performance. Neither perspective exists in a vacuum, and both resonate with different segments of the American public, which is precisely why their clashes generate such intense reactions and sustained attention. Yet what made this hearing different was that Ted Cruz refused to argue abstractly, refusing to debate socialism, immigration theory, or global justice in the usual terms, choosing instead to anchor the discussion in individual consequences. That choice forced Ilhan Omar into unfamiliar territory, where rhetorical fluency offers little protection against specific questions tied to names, letters, and timelines, and where silence becomes louder than outrage. I could see the shift happening in real time, not just in her posture, but in the room itself, as even sympathetic observers sensed that the conversation had escaped the gravitational pull of partisan reflex. At its core, this was a test of political ethics rather than political alignment, raising uncomfortable questions that lingered far beyond the hearing room and into the public imagination. Should elected officials be judged primarily by their ideological courage or by their responsiveness to ordinary people navigating complex bureaucracies? Is moral condemnation of a nation meaningful if it is paired with indifference toward those who serve that nation? And perhaps most controversially, does personal history grant permanent moral immunity, or does it impose an even higher standard of accountability? Ted Cruz was not asking these questions rhetorically, and Ilhan Omar could not dismiss them as bad faith without appearing evasive, which is why the tension escalated without a single raised voice. This dynamic explains why the exchange resonated so deeply across political lines, because it exposed a fracture not between conservatives and progressives, but between symbolism and service. As Part 1 closes, the stage is set for what comes next, because the hearing is about to move from framing to substance, from narrative to testimony, and from accusation to documentation. In the next section, Ted Cruz will begin introducing the human evidence he believes dismantles Ilhan Omar's defense, while she will be forced to choose between engagement and retreat, a decision that will define the rest of the confrontation. And the question hanging over everything remains simple, but devastating. When ideology collides with responsibility, which one survives public scrutiny? Ted Cruz did not raise his voice when he transitioned from framing to substance. And that restraint itself felt almost unsettling in a room accustomed to theatrical escalation rather than methodical confrontation. He reached for a folder with the practiced calm of someone who understood that documents speak louder than ideology. And as he did so, Ilhan Omar shifted slightly in her chair, sensing that the terrain beneath her feet was changing. The cameras leaned in, not because Cruz was dramatic, but because the silence carried expectation, the kind that signals something consequential is about to be placed into the public record. Cruz began by stating plainly that elected power is meaningless unless it is exercised on behalf of real people, a principle he insisted transcended party labels and moral posturing. It was at this moment that the hearing stopped feeling like a political performance and started to resemble an audit, one in which Ted Cruz positioned himself as the examiner and Ilhan Omar as the steward of unanswered obligations. He introduced the first constituent not as a symbol but as a name, deliberately slowing his cadence so that the audience could not dismiss the story as abstraction. Cruz explained that Mike Thompson was not a donor, not a political activist, and not a media personality, but a veteran who had served multiple tours and returned home carrying injuries that never make it into campaign speeches. The details were unglamorous by design, involving paperwork delays, unanswered correspondence, and bureaucratic confusion, the kind of realities that rarely trend online but quietly define people's lives. As Cruz read excerpts from Thompson's letters, the room grew noticeably still, because there is something deeply disarming about a story that contains no ideology, only frustration and fatigue. Ilhan Omar's expression hardened, not with anger, but with calculation, as she realized that responding to this story required more than rhetoric and more than moral framing. Cruz emphasized that Thompson had followed every procedural step, written multiple times, and waited months without acknowledgement, not demanding special treatment, but asking for navigation through a system designed to be navigated with help. He asked a question that landed without embellishment, wondering aloud how a congressional office that prides itself on advocacy could fail to respond even with a form letter. This was not an accusation framed as malice, but as neglect. And that distinction mattered, because neglect cannot be dismissed as persecution. The power of Cruz's approach lay in its refusal to escalate emotionally, forcing Ilhan Omar into the uncomfortable position of either engaging administratively or deflecting ideologically. When Omar responded by citing volume and staffing limitations, Cruz did not interrupt but waited, allowing her explanation to fully register before responding. He then introduced additional names, not rapidly, but deliberately, as if laying bricks one by one, building a structure that could not be ignored once complete. Each story followed a similar pattern, involving service, injury, bureaucratic delay, and silence from the office meant to intervene, creating a rhythm that made coincidence increasingly implausible. As an observer, I found myself noting how Cruz avoided hyperbole, letting repetition do the work of persuasion because patterns speak louder than accusations. Ilhan Omar attempted to reframe the exchange by reiterating her commitment to marginalized communities and global justice, but the shift felt misaligned with the specificity of the questions she was being asked. Cruz gently redirected, stating that global advocacy does not absolve local responsibility, a line that resonated precisely because it acknowledged the legitimacy of broader concerns without allowing them to excuse neglect. This moment crystallized the philosophical divide between Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar more clearly than any ideological debate could, revealing competing definitions of what moral leadership looks like in practice. Cruz's version, emphasized proximity and obligation, arguing implicitly that responsibility begins with those who can reach your office door or mailbox. Omar's version emphasized systemic critique, suggesting that moral energy is best spent challenging structures rather than addressing individual cases. The hearing exposed the tension between those approaches, forcing the audience to confront an uncomfortable question about whether one can substitute for the other. As Cruz continued, he broadened the scope of his inquiry, transitioning from veterans to donors, a move that carried its own political risks, but also its own evidentiary weight. He cited small-dollar contributions, emphasizing amounts that would be insignificant to national campaigns, but meaningful to individuals living paycheck to paycheck. By doing so, Cruz reframed campaign finance not as a legal abstraction, but as a moral transaction built on trust, where intent matters as much as compliance. He asked whether donors who believed they were supporting causes rather than consultants had been misled, a question that lingered in the air without requiring immediate resolution. Ilhan Omar bristled at this line of inquiry, accusing Cruz of implying corruption. But Cruz clarified that he was questioning priorities rather than legality, a distinction that further complicated her defensive posture. This was where humor, subtle and sharp, crept into the exchange, as Cruz remarked that transparency should not feel like hostility unless there is something to hide, a line that drew restrained reactions from the room. The comment was not a joke in the traditional sense, but a rhetorical needle that punctured the seriousness of Omar's accusations without resorting to mockery. It underscored a recurring theme in Cruz's strategy, which relied on understated irony rather than overt sarcasm to make its point. As the exchange continued, I found myself reflecting on how rarely hearings force politicians to answer questions that do not align with their chosen narratives. Ted Cruz was not asking Ilhan Omar to renounce her beliefs or defend her identity, but to account for her stewardship, a demand that carries a different and often heavier burden. This distinction helps explain why the atmosphere grew increasingly tense without becoming chaotic, as tension fed not on outrage, but on unresolved questions. The audience, both in the room and beyond it, began to sense that something deeper was at stake than partisan victory, because the hearing was exposing a gap between rhetoric and responsibility. Cruz's approach implicitly challenged the assumption that moral clarity excuses administrative failure, an assumption that underlies much of modern political activism. Ilhan Omar attempted once more to shift the focus outward, speaking about broader injustices and systemic inequities. But the move felt increasingly strained as the questions narrowed. Cruz responded by acknowledging the importance of systemic reform while insisting that systems are experienced by individuals, not abstractions, a point that landed with quiet force. This exchange revealed why Cruz, despite being a polarizing figure, remains effective in certain confrontations, because he understands how to collapse ideological distance into personal accountability. As Part 2 draws to a close, the hearing has reached a critical juncture, with Ted Cruz establishing a pattern that challenges Ilhan Omar's defense without directly attacking her identity. The questions remain unanswered, the stories unresolved, and the tension unresolved, creating a sense of anticipation that cannot be dismissed as mere political theater. In the next section, the confrontation will move from neglect to language, from silence to speech, as Cruz introduces evidence that forces Ilhan Omar to confront the consequences of words rather than actions alone. And looming over everything is a question that grows more difficult to evade with each passing minute. How much moral authority survives when responsibility goes unanswered? Ted Cruz paused longer than usual before beginning the next phase of his questioning, and that pause carried its own weight, because it signaled a deliberate shift from administrative accountability to moral consequence. He made it clear that governance is not only about what an official does or fails to do, but also about what an official says, especially when those words echo through history and land on people who have already endured unimaginable harm. Ilhan Omar straightened in her chair as Cruz introduced the next constituent, because this was no longer a discussion about paperwork delays or donor expectations, but about language, memory, and the scars words can reopen. Cruz spoke carefully, almost reverently, as he described an elderly woman from Omar's district, emphasizing her age not for sympathy, but to remind the room that time does not erase trauma. It only teaches people to carry it quietly. He explained that this woman had survived one of the darkest chapters of human history and came to America believing she had finally reached a place where the lies that once justified violence would never again be normalized. As Cruz read excerpts from her letter, the hearing room seemed to contract inward, because there are moments when politics collides with history in ways that silence even the most disciplined partisans. Ilhan Omar listened without interruption, but her earlier confidence was noticeably absent, replaced by a guarded stillness that suggested she understood the gravity of what was being placed before her. Cruz did not accuse her outright of malice, nor did he raise his voice, instead posing a question that cut deeper precisely because of its restraint, asking whether an elected official has a responsibility to understand how certain phrases resonate beyond their immediate intent. This was not a debate about foreign policy positions or geopolitical alliances, but about rhetorical inheritance, the uncomfortable truth that some words carry histories that cannot be wished away through disclaimers. Omar responded by asserting that her criticisms were directed at governments and policies, not at people, a distinction she had relied on repeatedly in the past to defend controversial remarks. Cruz acknowledged the distinction without conceding its sufficiency, suggesting that intent does not always determine impact, especially when historical trauma is involved. This exchange revealed another layer of the philosophical divide between Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar, because where she emphasized intention and context, he emphasized consequence and perception. As an analyst, I found this moment particularly telling, because it demonstrated how political language often operates on multiple levels simultaneously, shaping perceptions regardless of disclaimers or clarifications. Cruz pressed further, not by repeating accusations, but by asking whether Omar had ever directly engaged with those who felt harmed, an inquiry that reframed apology as relationship rather than performance. The question lingered because it challenged a common political instinct to address controversy through public statements rather than private accountability. Omar's response, focusing on public apologies and clarifications, felt procedural rather than personal, reinforcing the sense that the conversation was slipping beyond her control. Cruz's tone shifted subtly at this point, introducing a note of disappointment that proved more disarming than anger, because disappointment implies expectation. He suggested that leaders who emerge from histories of suffering carry a unique obligation to avoid language that mirrors past oppression, a point that resonated precisely because it acknowledged Omar's background rather than dismissing it. This approach complicated the narrative of persecution Omar had initially advanced, because it framed her not as a target, but as a steward of moral memory. The hearing then took an unexpected turn toward recent events, as Cruz referenced a politically charged tragedy that had ignited intense public reaction and media coverage. He spoke slowly, emphasizing the human cost rather than the ideological implications, reminding the room that behind every headline lies a family navigating grief that politics cannot justify exploiting. Ilhan Omar visibly tensed as Cruz questioned whether timing and tone matter when responding to violence, particularly when emotions are raw and facts still emerging. This was one of the few moments where Cruz allowed a trace of incredulity to enter his voice, asking whether any political point is so urgent that it cannot wait for basic compassion to be expressed. The question was not rhetorical, and that fact made it more uncomfortable because it demanded an answer rooted in values rather than strategy. Omar attempted to contextualize her remarks within a broader critique of political rhetoric, but the explanation struggled to address the emotional immediacy Cruz had established. This tension highlighted a recurring vulnerability in Omar's approach, which often prioritizes structural analysis at the expense of individual empathy. Cruz, sensing the shift, leaned into that vulnerability, suggesting that empathy delayed is empathy denied, particularly when public figures speak from positions of influence. As someone who has watched countless political controversies play out, I could not ignore how effectively Cruz reframed the issue, turning what might have been dismissed as a media skirmish into a moral inquiry. The room grew quieter still, because the exchange had transcended policy disagreement and entered the realm of character assessment. Cruz emphasized that disagreement does not require dehumanization, and that condemnation of ideas does not justify indifference to suffering, a principle that resonates across ideological boundaries. Ilhan Omar's responses became shorter, more guarded, as she navigated the narrowing space between explanation and evasion. This was not because she lacked rhetorical skill, but because the framework of the questioning denied her the ability to retreat into abstraction. Each time she attempted to widen the lens, Cruz gently but firmly narrowed it again, returning to specific moments, specific words, and specific people. The subtle irony of the exchange was that Cruz, often criticized as combative, appeared almost pastoral in his delivery, while Omar, often celebrated as a moral voice, appeared defensive. That inversion did not go unnoticed by observers because it challenged familiar stereotypes about both figures. As Part 3 comes to a close, the confrontation has reached a deeper level, shifting from administrative oversight to moral reckoning, from neglected letters to spoken words that cannot be taken back. The hearing now feels less like an inquiry into isolated actions and more like an examination of leadership philosophy itself. In the next section, the focus will turn to questions of legality, credibility, and unresolved inconsistencies, raising the stakes even further and forcing Ilhan Omar to confront challenges she cannot deflect through narrative alone. And hovering over everything is a question that grows more urgent with each exchange. When words wound and actions fall short, who bears responsibility for the harm left behind? Ted Cruz did not announce the transition to the next phase of the hearing, but everyone in the room could feel it, because the tone shifted from moral inquiry to procedural scrutiny, a move that carries its own quiet menace. He reminded the committee that accountability in a constitutional system is not limited to sentiment or symbolism, but also includes consistency, accuracy, and respect for sworn statements. Ilhan Omar stiffened perceptibly as Cruz framed this section not as an accusation, but as a request for clarification, a posture that made refusal appear unnecessary and evasion appear conspicuous. Cruz explained that credibility is cumulative, built slowly through alignment between words and records, and eroded quickly when discrepancies remain unresolved. He then posed a series of questions that were deliberately narrow, focusing not on ideology or motive, but on timelines, statements, and publicly available documentation. The brilliance of this approach lay in its simplicity, because it denied Omar the ability to retreat into rhetorical complexity and forced the discussion into verifiable territory. Cruz emphasized that when public trust is involved, clarity is not optional, and ambiguity, even if unintentional, corrodes confidence in institutions already under strain. Omar responded with visible irritation, accusing Cruz of dredging up settled controversies to score political points, a claim that drew muted reactions from the room. Cruz acknowledged the accusation calmly, stating that settled controversies leave behind settled answers, and unanswered questions remain unsettled regardless of how often they are dismissed. This exchange revealed a fundamental disagreement about closure, with Omar treating repetition as harassment and Cruz treating persistence as due diligence. As an analyst, I found this moment revealing because it highlighted how political fatigue is often weaponized to avoid revisiting uncomfortable inconsistencies. Cruz continued by stressing that sworn statements carry moral weight even when legal consequences are absent, because they represent a promise to the public as much as to the court. He asked whether the committee should accept explanations that rely on selective memory, a question that landed heavily without naming specific infractions. Omar's responses became increasingly procedural, invoking investigations, reviews, and conclusions without elaboration, a strategy that created distance rather than resolution. Cruz gently but firmly pressed for specificity, reminding her that references to conclusions without explanation ask the public to trust authority rather than evidence. This was one of the few moments where restrained humor surfaced again, as Cruz remarked that transparency should not require subpoenas to be persuasive, drawing restrained reactions from observers. The line was subtle but effective, because it underscored how openness loses credibility when it is framed as an inconvenience. Omar attempted to reclaim the narrative by accusing Cruz of hypocrisy, citing his own controversial positions and past statements, a pivot that momentarily shifted attention. Cruz did not deny his own record, instead acknowledging that public service invites scrutiny, and that he welcomes questions about his actions precisely because accountability is reciprocal. This response blunted the pivot because it removed the asymmetry Omar was attempting to create, placing both figures under the same standard. The exchange underscored a broader truth about political conflict, that deflection works best when the questioner appears unwilling to accept scrutiny themselves. As Cruz continued, he framed the issue not as personal wrongdoing, but as institutional integrity, arguing that unanswered inconsistencies weaken public confidence regardless of intent. Omar's posture shifted again from irritation to guarded composure, as she realized the discussion had moved beyond character attacks into credibility assessment. The room felt heavier because credibility is the currency of leadership, and once it is questioned, every subsequent statement is discounted. Cruz asked whether Omar believed elected officials owe their constituents full explanations, even when those explanations are inconvenient. A question that exposed the tension between political survival and ethical responsibility. Omar replied by reiterating her commitment to transparency, but the repetition lacked the detail Cruz had been pressing for, leaving the question unresolved. This unresolved state became the point itself because Cruz did not need admissions to make his case, only the absence of clarity. As the exchange unfolded, I could see how carefully Cruz avoided crossing into accusation, remaining anchored in inquiry and documentation. This restraint protected him from appearing vindictive while amplifying the discomfort Omar felt, because unanswered questions linger longer than contested claims. The hearing room's atmosphere shifted again, this time toward anticipation rather than tension, as observers sensed the cumulative effect of unanswered issues. Cruz summarized this section by stating that public trust cannot survive indefinitely on assurances alone, and that leadership requires the courage to confront uncomfortable details openly. Ilhan Omar responded by asserting that she would not legitimize what she described as bad faith questioning, a line that drew mixed reactions. Cruz replied quietly that questions only become bad faith when answers are forbidden, a statement that resonated precisely because it reframed refusal as a choice rather than a defense. As Part 4 draws to a close, the hearing has moved decisively into a credibility test, with Ilhan Omar facing mounting pressure not from accusations, but from the persistence of inquiry. The confrontation has now spanned administration, language, empathy, and procedure, leaving little untouched by scrutiny. In the next section, the focus will shift toward contrast, as Ted Cruz brings personal history and political philosophy into direct comparison, raising the emotional stakes without abandoning evidentiary discipline. And looming beneath it all is a question that grows heavier with every unanswered detail. How long can moral authority stand when credibility remains unresolved? Ted Cruz did something unexpected as the hearing entered its final stretch, stepping away from documents and timelines and into personal history, not as spectacle, but as contrast, a deliberate shift that reframed everything that had come before. He spoke about origins not to claim superiority, but to establish perspective, reminding the room that biography can inform values without excusing behavior. Ilhan Omar listened closely now because this was the terrain she knew well, the ground where stories of displacement, survival, and arrival in America are often treated as moral credentials rather than contextual facts. Cruz acknowledged that both of them were shaped by upheaval and exile, that both carried family histories defined by flight from instability, and that both had benefited from an America willing to open its doors. The similarity, he suggested, was undeniable, but similarity does not guarantee shared conclusions, a point that landed quietly yet forcefully. He described his father's journey with restrained detail, not lingering on suffering for effect, but emphasizing choice, particularly the decision to embrace the responsibilities that accompany freedom. Cruz spoke of learning English late at night, of work that was physically exhausting and emotionally humbling, and of gratitude that manifested not as silence, but as participation. This was not nostalgia, but instruction, because Cruz framed his family history as a lesson in stewardship rather than a shield against criticism. Ilhan Omar's posture tightened as Cruz articulated the contrast he intended, explaining that gratitude does not prohibit critique, but it does demand reciprocity. He argued that America's imperfections do not absolve leaders of the obligation to serve those who depend on them, especially those who lack media platforms or ideological utility. This framing forced Omar into a difficult position, because rejecting the premise risked appearing dismissive of ordinary constituents, while accepting it required confronting the unanswered questions already on the record. Cruz then articulated his broader philosophy, stating that systems matter, but systems are sustained by trust, and trust erodes when leaders appear selective in their empathy. He suggested that advocacy without accountability becomes performance, and performance without responsibility becomes exploitation, a formulation that drew visible reactions across the room. The power of this argument lay in its universality, because it applied equally to conservatives and progressives, leaving no ideological refuge. Omar attempted to counter by asserting that structural injustice demands priority over individual cases, a claim that resonates strongly within activist circles. Cruz did not dismiss the claim outright, instead asking whether structural reform is strengthened or weakened when individual obligations are neglected. This question lingered because it exposed a tension many activists avoid addressing: the assumption that macro-level justice excuses micro-level failure. As an observer, I found this moment especially revealing, because it articulated a critique often felt, but rarely stated, so plainly in public discourse. Cruz continued by returning to the theme of leadership, arguing that moral authority is not self-declared, but earned through consistency between message and conduct. He suggested that leaders who demand accountability from institutions must be willing to model it themselves, a standard that becomes more demanding as influence grows. Ilhan Omar's responses at this stage were noticeably restrained, focusing on values rather than specifics, a strategy that maintained ideological clarity but avoided resolution. Cruz's tone remained controlled, almost reflective, as he emphasized that disagreement does not imply enmity, and that scrutiny does not equate to persecution. This distinction mattered, because it stripped away the emotional framing Omar had relied on earlier, leaving the substance of the exchange exposed. The hearing room felt different now, less adversarial and more contemplative, as if the participants understood that the confrontation had moved beyond winning or losing. Cruz closed this section by reiterating that America's promise is sustained not by slogans but by service, and that freedom carries obligations that cannot be outsourced to ideology. He reminded the room that public office is not an inheritance, but a trust renewed daily through responsiveness and integrity. Ilhan Omar responded by asserting that history would judge their exchange, a statement that carried both defiance and fatigue. Cruz replied calmly that history judges actions more harshly than intentions, a line that drew a quiet murmur from the audience. As Part 5 comes to an end, the confrontation has reached its philosophical apex, with both figures articulating competing visions of what leadership in America demands. The unresolved questions now hang heavier than ever, not because they are inflammatory, but because they touch the core of democratic responsibility. In the final section, the hearing will move toward closure, not through resolution, but through consequence, as the broader public reaction begins to take shape beyond the walls of the committee room. And the final question looms, unavoidable and deeply unsettling. When freedom is given, how will those who receive it choose to honor it? The hearing did not end with a gavel slammed in triumph or a final verbal blow, but with something far more unsettling, a silence that lingered as the room emptied and the cameras powered down, leaving unanswered questions to travel on their own. Ted Cruz gathered his papers without flourish, his demeanor unchanged, as if the weight of what had been said required no punctuation beyond its own existence. Ilhan Omar remained seated for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, caught between defiance and calculation, aware that the confrontation had escaped the confines of the committee room and entered a far less predictable arena. I have watched enough political theater to recognize when an exchange ends cleanly and when it continues elsewhere, and this one clearly belonged to the latter category. Because what unfolded next did not depend on Cruz's rhetoric or Omar's rebuttals, but on how millions of viewers interpreted the contrast between questions asked and questions avoided. Clips from the hearing spread quickly, not the loudest moments, but the quiet ones, the pauses, the names, the steady cadence that resisted easy dismissal. Commentators across the spectrum attempted to frame the exchange in familiar terms, some calling it a partisan ambush, others describing it as overdue scrutiny, but neither label fully captured what people had actually seen. What resonated most was not ideology, but imbalance, the sense that one side kept returning to specific responsibilities while the other kept reaching for broader explanations. For many viewers, this distinction mattered more than party affiliation, because it spoke to a fatigue that transcends political tribes, the exhaustion with rhetoric that never quite resolves into service. Ted Cruz did not declare victory in interviews afterward, nor did he escalate his criticism, choosing instead to reiterate that his questions remained open and that answers not outrage, were what constituents deserved. Ilhan Omar, by contrast, framed the hearing as an extension of long-standing hostility toward her identity and politics, a narrative that still resonated with her most loyal supporters. Yet even within sympathetic circles, there was a noticeable hesitation, an unease with how easily concrete questions had been set aside. This hesitation is important because it signals a shift not in ideology, but in expectation. A growing insistence that moral clarity must coexist with operational accountability. As someone who analyzes political incentives, I see this moment as emblematic of a larger reckoning within American politics, one in which symbolic defiance is no longer sufficient to sustain trust. The confrontation between Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar did not resolve their differences, nor was it meant to, but it clarified the stakes of leadership in an era saturated with narrative and suspicion. Cruz framed leadership as obligation, arguing implicitly that power without responsiveness becomes self-indulgent, no matter how righteous the language surrounding it. Omar framed leadership as resistance, emphasizing the importance of challenging systems even when doing so provokes backlash and misunderstanding. Both perspectives will continue to shape American discourse, but the hearing exposed the cost of allowing one to eclipse the other entirely. What lingered most for viewers were the unanswered questions, not because they proved anything conclusively, but because they highlighted the gap between authority and accessibility. That gap is where public trust erodes quietly, not through scandal alone, but through the accumulation of small neglects and deflections. In the days that followed, the conversation shifted away from the personalities involved and toward a broader reflection on what constituents expect from those who represent them. People debated whether empathy should be measured in statements or in actions, whether accountability should yield to ideology, and whether criticism of a nation carries obligations to its people. These are not questions with easy answers, but they are unavoidable in a democracy that relies on consent rather than coercion. Ted Cruz returned to his routine, his posture unchanged, seemingly content to let the record speak for itself rather than amplifying it through spectacle. Ilhan Omar continued her advocacy, undeterred in tone, yet now operating under a sharper lens, one that scrutinized not only what she opposed, but what she delivered. The hearing did not crown a victor, but it altered the terrain, shifting expectations in subtle but meaningful ways. For some, it reinforced admiration for Cruz's methodical approach. For others, it deepened loyalty to Omar's unapologetic activism, but for many it introduced discomfort, the sense that neither rhetoric nor resistance alone is enough. As an analyst, I find that discomfort instructive, because democracy depends not on comfort, but on friction that forces reflection. The exchange asked Americans to consider whether leadership is proven by how fiercely one speaks or by how faithfully one responds, a question that will echo long after the hearing fades from memory. Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar will continue to clash because their visions of America are fundamentally different. But this moment revealed that clashes matter less than what they expose. They expose expectations, inconsistencies, and the fragile contract between elected officials and those who place their trust in them. In the end, the most consequential outcome of the hearing was not a headline or a viral clip, but a quiet recalibration of what accountability sounds like when stripped of theatrics. It sounded like questions without insults, names without abstractions, and a refusal to let moral language substitute for measurable responsibility. Whether that recalibration endures remains uncertain, because politics has a way of reverting to noise when scrutiny wanes. But for a brief moment, in that room and beyond it, the conversation shifted, and Americans were reminded that power is not only about what you stand against, but about who you stand for. That reminder, more than any accusation or defense, is what gave the confrontation between Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar its lasting weight, and why it continues to resonate beyond the walls of the Senate hearing room.